Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are logging in from. Welcome to our Talking About Transitions dialogue series, with today our virtual panel discussion on the future of nature in India's mid-sized cities. I am Prerna Singh, Research Fellow at Transitions Research, and I will be your moderator for today's conversation. I'm just edit my screen so we all can see each other better. At Transitions Research, we focus on generating anticipatory knowledge on the complex interplay between technology, society, and sustainability in transition processes. We bridge the gap between new knowledge, public policy, and societal action. Our Talking About Transitions dialogue series features critical conversations on the systemic shifts and interplay of technology, society, and sustainability. We have a distinguished panel of experts joining today to explore the future of nature in India's rapidly growing mid-sized cities. As we begin, let me briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. First of all, we have Dr. Anjali Karol Mohan. Dr. Mohan is an urban and regional planner by profession and has a PhD in governance and technology. She's a partner at Integrated Design, where she leads action research at the intersection of planning, urbanization, and environment. Currently, she is researching climate change responsive planning frameworks that focus on resilient and livable cities. Her professional experience over the past 3 decades straddles development, institutional and policy frameworks, urban planning, and management and information and communication technologies and development. She is a faculty at various prestigious institutes across the country and has published extensively in academic journals as well as popular media. She has served on multiple task forces. Most recently, she was a member of the expert panel to the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, advising on statewide comprehensive urban development strategy. Welcome, Dr. Anjali Mohan. Secondly, we have Dr. Dhruva Purkayastha. He is the India Director at Climate Policy Initiative. Dr. Purkayastha is also the chairperson of the Transition Finance Committee at the International Financial Service Centers Authority, or IFSCA, and the member of the Net Zero Council of India. He has led regulatory groups for Sustainable Finance Task Force set up by the Ministry of Finance and has actively contributed to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group agenda. With over 30 years of experience across just a very wide range of sectors, his research interests are in financing infrastructure and clean energy, corporate sustainability, and climate finance. He holds a PhD from IIT Delhi on financing infrastructure and currently is a visiting faculty at IIM Calcutta and other universities. Welcome, Dr. Dhruva Purkayastha. And finally, we have Dr. Vikram Mathur, founding director of Transitions Research. Here, Dr. Mathur's set up India's first urban living lab, testing socio-technical innovations in real city settings. He researches norms and institutions that can help manage environmental opportunities and challenges associated with emerging technology. Dr. Mathur is a senior fellow of the Observer Research Foundation India, a senior fellow of Center for Social and Behavioral Changes, and an associate fellow of the Stockholm Environmental Institute. Welcome, Dr. Vikram. Welcome, Dr. Dhruva. Welcome, Dr. Anjali. So today's dialogue aims at exploring the future of nature in India's rapidly growing mid-sized cities, questioning how to navigate rapid urban expansion, climate change, and the needs and aspirations of communities who depend on nature and urban development. We'll go through each panelist's thoughts on the broader topic today, and then we'll delve deeper into the expertise of individual panelists here on the range of aspects relevant to integrating nature in urban development. We'll spend around 5 minutes for each individual response, and I'll try to keep track of time. The audience here, please feel free to enter your questions at any time in the chat, and we'll go over them towards the end of the discussion. So let's get started. My first question is to all the panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Dhruva Purkayastha here. Dr. Dhruva, in your experience working in this space, in the context of both rapid urbanization and climate change, what will nature look like in our cities, and what role would it play in the coming future?
Thank you, Prerna. To start with, let me compliment Transitions Research for putting out a unique theme and cutting across not only sustainability. Transition is a buzzword across many sectors today and is possibly right at the heart of what we are living through. I do work in a limited space, and therefore transitions for me happens to be low carbon transition. And uh, to come back to cities, cities remain the engines of economic growth for whatever reasons, because there is urban agglomeration, there is shift of human population, there is economic centers, there's industrial services centers. India services tends to grow. So from a point of view of looking at low carbon transition, and that's where I'm kind of, there are transitions otherwise too, and which I can see from your work, but limiting myself to so-called low carbon transitions, cities do need to play an integral role. And now nature remains at the heart of it, particularly because, see, at the end of the day, when we talk of net zero, and when the world talks of net zero and our policies, however, well after surely my lifetime, given the need to reach that net zero, nature is your only technology that is available in terms of extracting the stock of CO2. So let me put it in the carbon cycle context, because the problem that we are faced with is a problem of stock of GHG gases and not the flow, essentially. However, we are constrained, and that's what it is coming out to be, that we are trying to we are trying to reduce the flow of GHG CO2 into the environment, into the atmosphere, and in the hope that the curve will bend. It's like a COVID curve. When does it bend? Bend at some point of time of R0. The whole question is, there is a tipping point to which it needs to bend. Otherwise, it's like a trajectory going up forever. Now, and therefore, where there is emissions, whether that nature sits within urban cities in India or not, may not be that important. But the role of nature, let's not miss out one more point. More than mitigation contribution, there is an impact of climate change which is visible in India. And India happens to be one of the top 20 vulnerable countries. And you have seen, if you can actually look at India's own research and Department of Science and Technology, you will see how vulnerability has been scored essentially as a function of, uh, they're looking at exposure, but exposure to hazards, exposure to how vulnerable the state is and the district is. Now, the need for nature over there to allow us to adapt, allow us to cope up with the impact of climate change, which means what is adaptation? It is more water, more rains, more snow, more heat, and all of it, nature does play a role. Have we, over the years, focused on nature in urbanization? The answer is simply no. Have we ever focused on nature, on urbanization? No. We can come to the legal framework of urban fiscal devolution, which is your next question. But I'd like to end here that we have not, over the years, ever looked at nature as an integral component of our urban city. From an urban or a city or a planning point of view, planners from which Dr. Anjali might be able to talk better because she's qualified to talk on that rather than myself. But surely there was an aspect, but has India looked at it and brought into it as integral uh, system of urban cities planning? No. But does it play a role? For sure. Does it need to be brought into the center stage? Yes, for sure. I'll pause here and I'll come back on to other questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgess. And I think looking at nature as not just the mitigation, but also solution, but also one as solution towards vulnerability, which our urban cities are very much in the center of vulnerability and threat from climate hazards is definitely key. Dr. Anjali Mohan, would you like to share your thoughts on this next? How do you visualize the future of nature in emerging cities in the context of climate change and rapid urbanization?
Thanks a lot, Prerna, and thanks to Transition Research for calling me here and also bringing, as I said, two very pertinent topics together in the urbanization trajectory of the country. One is the small and medium towns, and the other is nature, of course. So the question is what will or what should nature look like as India urbanizes, especially in the small and urbanization as it picks up in the small and medium towns. I think that will depend a lot on how urbanization is steered or directed, and this needs a very careful consideration. Something that is an emerging imperative, especially if we look at the cities and the role of the way nature is brought into both plan and policy. I would agree with the previous panelists that it's almost non-existent. We don't bring in, the planning frameworks in the country have not really still brought in this resource into the plans of the cities, primarily because our planning frameworks are very, very colonial in their approach and the way they treat cities. Having said that, I think it should and it will, if urbanization is steered carefully, should look and will look very different from what it is looking right now. Right now, even to begin with, where ordinarily we don't have much of a focus on the role of nature in provisioning or regulating or providing various services to the city, but even where the consciousness has come in, and it is coming in, though it is very limited to a community. I think the consciousness has come in and the way nature is being brought into the cities is, again, a very alien view. It is largely from a very aesthetic, it's a very aesthetic view. At best, it has gone on to incorporating certain health considerations, again, for a very limited population. At best, further, if we push it, yes, there is a consciousness around nature bringing in biodiversity, which is depleting in cities, right? So beyond that, we have not thought of nature. But nature, if you really go back to the way traditionally hamlets, and I won't say cities or villages, but the way hamlets had a dependency on nature and a relationship with nature, it was provisioning, it was actually bringing in a lot of ecosystem services, right? And these are of various categories, the ecosystem services, and I'll speak a little bit more about it as we proceed. But hopefully, as we steer our urbanization trajectory in the country, we should be able to bring back nature in its entirety, where it is provisioning cities, it is regulating various aspects of cities, it is including, cultural aspects. But most importantly, I think what we need to focus in when we bring nature back into the cities is its ability to nurture livelihoods in a very decentralized manner. And that's where cities are struggling. And because the current trajectory of urbanization is constantly displacing people, right? People who have had a strong dependency on nature, but have also been stewards of nature. And in this displacement, we see a lot of gentrification that then occurs or manifests eventually. So I think nature has to look very different if we are to, as our cities, small and medium cities grow, and there is a lot of potential over there. So it has to move beyond a riverfront development or a lake restoration. I'm not saying any of these are bad. They are undesirable. There are desirable goals, but these are limited goals. So we need to look beyond these.
I also really liked your framing of what it should look like instead of what it will look like, for us to have a intentional version when we speak about what nature should look like in our futures. And also the relevance of it moving from just ad hoc aesthetic integrations to like a codependent relationship between the communities and nature here. Very well. Dr. Vikram, what is your take on the future of nature and urbanization in mid-sized cities?
No, I mean, I'll definitely hang on to Anjali's framing on what it should look like, right? Rather than what it will look like, because the will is harder uh, to uh, to kind of predict. But I definitely think the reason, obviously, that this topic is really interesting is that I think the kind of small mid-sized cities or growing mid-sized cities, and we operate out of one which is Panjim, have to can potentially be uh, sandboxes, innovation gardens, or whatever you want to think about doing this whole urbanization trajectory differently. And what we see in parts of urbanization sometimes in Goa or in some other states in southern India is that there is this kind of integrated urban rural landscape that is emerging, right? And one is trying to see if that sort of an urbanization can be the template for future small and mid-sized Indian cities as they grow and take the hinterland with them. This has obviously not happened in the past, but I think that's the other thing. And also from a kind of pure nature conservation perspective, this idea that you have to protect nature within protected areas and these enclosures is also sort of somewhat outmoded. And even with other species and not just kind of flora, but also animal species and so on and so forth. The idea that in the Anthropocene, as 70% of our country is urban, we have to find imaginations where we can kind of cohabit the same space without having these strict boundaries. So I think so definitely I think that's the role that nature has to play. I mean, obviously, I'm quite interested in the connection of all of this, as the first speaker also said, with kind of the whole climate solutions perspective, right? And somewhat concerned about uh, the idea of urban nature as being seen purely as a carbon sink, right? And what is the direction in which that might drive us? Would it and in the past, if I'm old enough to know that there were other such mechanisms, like there was the clean development mechanism, where kind of some of these global policy objectives in some sense, I think co-opted the conversation and compromised local goals, right? So I totally agree with Anjali that people, and not carbon, needs to be at the center of these imaginations, and we cannot. And that has both kind of ecological implications of the sorts of species you plant and so on and so forth, but also has implications for the access that local communities and local knowledge has to the green spaces that might or might not exist, right? So I think that tension is quite important at this point, and I would perhaps talk about that a little bit more when it's my turn again, so to speak. Over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Vikram. And I think you make a good point of mid-sized cities that are going towards being major cities to be a great place of piloting and jump-starting innovation while we work on this blurring the boundaries of human and non-human coexistence, as we are really expanding our footprint of urban development. So we have to make sure that we're not just taking their space away, but a cohesive, cohabitable environment. Thank you so much for all panelists on your broad thoughts. Let's then dive deeper into our discussion. And I'll start with Dr. Anjali on this time. You spoke about how urban development and maybe unstructured urban development has led to gentrification and displacement in various places. Looking at it from a positive standpoint, how can urban greening initiatives be implemented in a manner that minimizes gentrification and displacement?
Okay, so I think to begin with, I am not very fond of this word or this terminology, urban greening. because it kind of conjures up an image of, these very manicured landscapes that we at least have grown up as we have trained ourselves in different disciplines, at least from a planning perspective, I would say. But if you were to, again, I'll go back to your initial framing of if you were to bring back city ecologies or nature or any ecologies back into the natural ecologies into the city, or if you were to retain them, revive them, restore them, I will pick up what I said earlier, that these have to be actually imagined in their entirety where they are giving various services, right? So, and at a very decentralized level, then because they are provisioning a certain community, a certain neighborhood, or a certain part of the city, how do you then build in stewardship into this relationship? And I think we just have to go back a little bit into our own history to understand how this has been done in the past, and it has always existed in the past. Now, to begin with, I think in the small and medium cities, there is a lot of potential, because as these cities grow, we can, for instance, start to understand that, a lot of the services, for example, food, which comes through agriculture, let's say fish, let's say poultry, let us say milk, and everything else, cities require this, right? Now, as we urbanize, because there is a perceived differentiation between urban users and rural users, we tend to push them away, even as cities in our urbanization trajectory. That's why I said that instead of pushing these, the trajectory itself needs a little bit of steering, but for instance, upfront mapping ecologies and saying this is at the city, sub-city scale, and say these are non-negotiables as the city expands. So even if you were to bring in, for example, let's say urban food gardens into the city, right? You have a certain natural ecology, let's say it's a river or a lake. Instead, you need to, for example, incentivize agriculture into the city. It is very, very critical. And this has to be done because the city requires it. So you start to look at productive landscapes around, or some shades of productive landscapes around city ecologies, and say, how do you start? And it doesn't stop at that. One is to visibilize them. Next is to, kind of say that this is what the land, this particular land use will look like, but then also what are the zoning regulations around it. So for me, this whole idea of bringing back the natural ecology, or whether it's green or blue, I think we need to assign functions to it, which will then provision the city, which will then regulate the city or neighborhoods. And we need to actually start to, as I said, embed our livelihoods in these, such that we don't displace people. As the city is expanding, let's say you have a lake or some other ecology, as the real estate takes over, and that's typically what happens, right? Real estate takes over, and then what are you doing? The lure of money is so much that communities actually transact on their lands, and they move into the city, and that's the informality or the gentrification you're seeking, a lot of displacement. So actually break the binary between the rural and the urban land uses and bring the perceived rural land uses into the city is, I think, in its entirety, would how we would start to bring in blue and green elements into the city.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali. And I think it's a great segue in our next question, because you talk about connecting livelihood with nature within urban, within cities and urban development, which takes us from urban planning to the financial implications here as we grow. And I'd like to ask my next question to Dr. Dhruva Purkayastha. How can cities in India, especially growing mid-sized cities, be physically empowered to integrate nature in urban development?
Thanks, Prerna. So I just want to relate and agree and blend to what Vikram and Anjali said, because I was the one who started with low carbon. Now let me explain how does this link to the wider picture. And I agree with Vikram in terms of saying it's not only carbon. No, it's not only carbon is absolutely correct. The entire thing is okay. All of us have heard ESG. For the present moment, I'm leaving ESG aside and I'm just picking up the E part of it. The E part of it is environment. But the problem part of the international politics, and Vikram alluded to it to a certain extent, is the focus on the emissions part of E, which is a subset. And let us remember there are two other elements to E, which is water and air, and they are not necessarily carbon in any way. India is home to top 83 of, rather 83 of the top 100 most polluted cities in the world. And they are cities, yeah. So that is clean air. Clean air links to health, links to livelihoods, links to productivity, links to economic output, links to everything. So, but that is again unlinked, very unlinked to carbon. And that's a great point to put in, to say that it is not only carbon for sure, and therefore it's a trilemma kind of a situation. We need to address the emissions, we need to address air, and we need to address water. And I'm currently, while agreeing with it, for me, not a planner, I don't have the perspectives which Anjali has, and surely I do get the understanding, but uninformed enough to comment on that. But let me put these three things together, and that then brings me to the fiscal and the financial parts of it. What is construed is what we talk of as nature-based solutions. It has mitigation and adaptation elements both, and I'm now talking climate, and then you put air and water. So you make the three. And beyond that point, there is another trilemma on the three sides of the triangle, which is, if we assume that we are not, India does not live in its villages, India will live in its cities. That's the point I'm trying to get to. While India did live in its villages, India in future will live in its cities. And cities will, I think at every juncture we have had this conversation to ultimately accept that urban agglomeration, having been faced with a lot of breakbacks, but still remains the vector and a trajectory to income growth and pathways and jobs as a pathways out of poverty. If at all if at all it is measured, development is measured only by income, if at all. That's a separate discussion in the first place. Now on India, on financing. Okay, it's exactly 33 years ago, if I'm not 32, 33 years ago, when India enacted the 73rd and the 74th Amendment to the Constitution of India, which ostensibly empowered the rural and the urban local bodies. It shifted the functions, I think in Schedule 12, to the cities, to the city governments, to the urban local bodies, to the rural local bodies. A fair bit has possibly still happened on the rural side. And this is urban nature. So where we stand today is as follows. In very simple terms, the amendment to the Constitution has not been implemented. Let's take the top 100 cities. 74th Amendment does not apply, applies to the devolution of functions, does not apply to the devolution of fiscal federalism. Why and how? You have a National Finance Commission, which then transfers 43% of the money to the state, but state finance commissions are either emasculated or non-existent for doing the same thing between the state and the center. Between the state and the local body. So what are we left with? We are left with a few large metropolitan cities because of their power of economic engine and because of their power of property taxes, of exceptional real estate values, their fiscal financial position of municipalities are good to great. But when we talk of mid-size, when you get to beyond, you will find only a handful. To prove my point, the requirement of urban investment, and that investment can be nature, can be restoring nature, can be urban infrastructure, can be water, can be cleaning air, can be cleaning, arresting pollution at source, can be all of it. That requires investment, that requires capacity, and that requires projects to then be developed. And for that, the financing for municipalities, it is easier to say municipal bonds. And yeah, we have green municipal bonds of about 100 crores and 200 crores. The numbers put out is 184 lakh crore. Today we are talking of 800 billion in the next 5 years, is a 2022 report which talks of 800 billion, which is we are talking of investments in 5 years. The scale of total municipal bonds till date over the 25 years is less than 5,000 crore INR, and that I'm talking in dollars. So the sources of finance, sources of ability to tax, and the distribution of what is. Now one can politically think of that, okay, I need to take the money from Mumbai to support Gachiroli. Yeah, great, sure. I mean, that's the idea. But then that redistribution of state revenues, of tax and non-tax revenue, sorry, direct and indirect. By the way, direct taxes, there is nothing that neither the state or the municipality can do. We're talking of indirect taxes only. So in terms of sources, in terms of the reversal that the planning commission or finance commission needs to do, I don't think, by the way, the 15th one was led by NK Singh. Whether it was the 15th or the 14th, I'm missing it. Now we have the 16th Finance Commission constituted. That made it very, very clear that the urban devolution percentage has to be fixed between, if 43% is going to the state, that the state therefore has to agree to have the X percentage of that 43 or whatever percentage it receives to its local bodies, and local primarily urban. So you are in a situation where the local body, and finally on governance, the democracy of a local body is a sham. And why is the democracy of a local body a sham? Because the municipal commissioner is a bureaucrat. It's not the mayor. The mayor is not empowered enough. So the elected representative is not empowered to address the voice or the citizens' charter that comes. Some cities have tried evolving a citizens' charter. So you need this change right from the top to implementation down of this amendment and carry that forward for this fiscal federalism to work, to empower the cities, whether it is for nature, whether it is for urban infrastructure, whether it is for clean air, whether it is for water, whether it is for low carbon growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zirba. Vikram, I think you have a question. Do you want to come in? You are muted.
Sorry, before I speak, I think something that I do want to ask is, do you feel like climate finance or climate markets, and particularly uh, this kind of enthusiasm around investment in nature-based solutions, can any of this realistically play a serious, significant, important role in kind of securing nature in our cities? That's something that I constantly wonder, because I see so many startups that they are in the space of, carbon credits and offset schemes and nature-based offset schemes. What's your thought on all of that?
My simple answer is no, Vikram. This is fad. You want to tell me that? So this is what I was talking in one of the COPs to a person who said, no, in Netherlands, you have the farmers paying for the dikes to protect the seawater in. I said, yeah, great. So let's go and try that in Odisha to build cyclone shelters and make the farmers pay for it. Let's see how the farmers are able to pay. The whole point is your view of the world in Netherlands and the view of the problem that we face on 5 cyclones in Odisha is very different. So yes, so it's a similar kind of a situation. So the user of nature-based solutions paying, and therefore, but please understand, the business models are not working there. Businesses are smart, corporates are smart, private sector is smart. They are working on the periphery of technology, and there is nothing wrong in that. Technology can be applied for every human use, not necessarily AI, but technology can be applied for every human use. So those business models are on technology. But if we are trying to assume that tomorrow I need to have temperatures shooting up to 55 degrees centigrade, and you need cool roofs, which is supposed to be quote unquote a solution, and you need urban forests over there, and there will be a private investment in urban forests and you'll make money. So my point is, I clearly agree with you. Clearly, the answer is no. So my point is, you're not going to have Indian hotels going there on the coastline on the east of India and build Taj hotels over there where people will pay 10,000 a night to save themselves from cyclone. No, but these impacts are for real. The impact of climate change, whether you contributed to it over the last 150 years or not, the whole issue is climate equity is very iniquitous. Let's understand very clearly, because India did not contribute to the stock which exists. Now we are being said that you reduce your flow, but my growth and my carbon budget is lost to be able to, because India's urban infrastructure needs to be built. So going by even very well reputed consultants, 60% of India needs to be built into the future. We are not yet built there. Now, in building there is steel and cement. The steel and cement will produce CO2 in some way, in the manner. So we can't escape that. We can green the pathway. But anyway, long story short, those are fanciful for sure. And I don't, carbon credits and carbon offsets, it's like, yeah, yes and no, because voluntary, not the national carbon markets. If there is an offset and there is somebody willing to pay for it, Government of India has launched a green credit scheme, but we are yet to see how it works. But yeah, it's a good policy step to say that if you do these positive, quote unquote, positive things, we'll give you a green credit. But we need to see the buyer for that green credit and the demand for that green credit to come in. So yeah, a lot of it is in the dimensions which are unclear on business models, unclear on how it will make money. And therefore, I think it's a public finance issue. And therefore, I'm concentrating on public finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zubal. And I think you bring out a very good point of the context. Like the Indian context is very different than some other developed countries. And when cities go towards financing and planning this nature integration with urban development, and they look for best practices outside of India, they need to be aware of this contextual difference that being an Indian city would bring, and looking at uniqueness of that and different ways to finance. Moving forward, NBS, without a doubt, great solution for mitigation, reducing carbon, but it is also, as Dr. Dhruva did mention previously, is taking up as a solution of climate risk reduction. My next question here is to Dr. Vikram on it. As NBS is emerging as a climate risk and vulnerability reduction solution, how do we address the debate around its efficacy against traditional risk reduction methods? And how do we balance the physical infrastructure-based risk reduction, resilience, with nature integration and nature as a solution of risk reduction?
So, I mean, I think obviously, I mean, one of the things that I harp on about, and I'll just bring it up again, is that very often the way we are thinking about nature-based solutions is very much mitigation focused, right? So it's very carbon focused, and it's leading to imaginaries around afforestation, you know, potentially monocultures of species that are just absorbing carbon, but nature obviously plays a really strong role in many adaptive processes, right? Like so I don't think it's a trade-off between kind of hard infrastructure and nature, but I think nature in itself, obviously, we saw in a crisis like COVID, it was the first kind of recourse of local communities for food. It's also even in big cities like Delhi, you have livelihoods that are dependent on farming in the Yamuna River basin, right? So I think nature plays a really strong role in food security. It plays a strong role in kind of, for example, dealing with extreme heat, which is rising in Indian cities. It plays a really strong role in flood mitigation strategies as a way to for water to flow in. So I think I don't know how to put a kind of what's the trade-off with hard infrastructure, but I definitely think that that in some sense, if we think of NBS as not just carbon sinks, but also think about the various other ecosystem services that bring adaptive capacity to communities, around various sorts of climate risks, then I think then we might come up with better sorts of solutions, emerging. So I think, yeah, I think that's and I also just want to quickly respond to what the previous panelists were saying, is that I also, I mean, I don't understand finance. I'm an anthropologist. I don't understand finance, but I also have strong concerns about the relationship between NBS and offsets, right? Because obviously, it's difficult to say that anything is wrong with nature. It's a win-win strategy, as many people say. But like as soon as you link it to offsets, you start worrying about privatization and commodification of nature in ways that it could get enclosed and could lead to restricted access of local communities, right? So that I think is a big issue. But also, I don't know if, I mean, the business model, to me, at least to somebody who doesn't understand business model, seems to be there. But I think the problem is really that that there is, there's every few weeks you hear of a major offset scam that's going on, or you hear of some real, injustice being perpetrated on some indigenous communities around, enclosure of large scale forests for global carbon goals. So I think those are the sorts of kind of perspectives that I think about when I think about the adaptive potential of nature. And yeah, and would I mean, were we to imagine a completely natural city, would it be less prone to disasters? Like, I mean, sometimes you go to Dubai and you feel like, okay, nobody's going to be hit by a flood here. Everything is so man-made and so controlled. But I don't know. I don't know if I can I can relate to that vision. But I mean, hypothetically speaking, we could live in a really, we could live in I don't know, bunkers and survive a cyclone, perhaps. But I don't know if that's the imagination that we want to put forward. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
I definitely don't want to live in a bunker. So let's hope we have a better future out there. We will take a few questions from the audience here in the 10 minutes since we have. So the
There are
first
two questions. I saw that there are two questions. One of
Yes.
them I just want to quickly respond. And this idea about the human versus nature divide question, and that's something as an anthropologist I do think about and have some insights on. But I feel like there's obviously on the one hand we can claim that those normative frameworks do have a serious implication, and there's a lot of literature that I see coming out around the kind of that how these boundaries need to be blurred in the Anthropocene. So conceptually, I do agree with that, but I very often now feel like that, and I see it like even like research is showing that very often those kind of very pro-environmental values don't really translate into pro-environmental behaviors or actions, right? Like I think that
Yeah.
that is really coming out. So anthropologists dream that, oh, if we were to conceptualize Ganga as the mother, we would go about saving the Ganga. I mean, that is really not happening. So I am increasingly interested in not just value and normative framework, but just practical statutory provisions for better planning and so on and so forth. Yeah, but that's just my thoughts on that.
So the question that Vikram was answering was about this fundamental issue of seeing humans as outside of nature and nature as a service to humans. The first question that we have here. And the question framed was how urban planning or design would be keeping the central fact that it's not just humans, but all living beings that occupy that space, and how that would potentially change urban planning. I'll also like to get Dr. Anjali's thoughts on it, as we have her as an expert on this area.
So, I mean, as Vikram said, that conceptually, yes, we need to not just think about humans, but we also we need to think about beyond the human. I'll also take the next question because both are intrinsically linked, and I thought I would try and answer these together. From a planning perspective, to begin with, I think when we look at nature-based solutions, or there are various terminologies. Let's take the more popular one within the planning parlance today, where a lot of regulatory changes are also being made, which is around blue-green infrastructure or blue-green networks, right? So how do you to begin with, I think these are very, very critical, at least in the Indian city, which is highly unequal and unequal as an adaptation strategy. And these, especially when they're implemented, and they are being implemented, it's just that they are not very visible, or people resort to nature-based solutions primarily as a survival strategy. So we need to pick up from that and start looking at how these can be put into brought in as formal adaptation strategies, or how can we institutionalize these through regulatory and statutory frameworks? I think that's the fundamental question if we were to bring our cities, which are not constantly polarized between environment and conservation, between conservation and development, right? So somewhere we need to see how do we balance these, and urban planning therefore is a great tool in doing that. How do you balance this? And how do you do it? Actually, to say that development needs to be reconceptualized. It doesn't have to be big infrastructure. It doesn't have to be glitzy infrastructure. It can be infrastructure that is required at a local level, that is, relevant to the communities who are the user base, which can be very local. So I think from that perspective, we need to balance these out and bring in NBS or any of the nature, I would say overall, as more a kind of not on the other end of the continuum as far as development is concerned, but how do we start to reconceptualize development along keeping nature in mind? So that's my first point. The second point is that, when we are making these decisions, and there was a lot of conversation in the previous, between the two panelists to say that there is this discussion between, or decisions between gray infrastructure and blue-green infrastructure, right? It is not even, as far as the decision, there is no question of trade-off, because as far as the decision maker is concerned, it's not even there on the table. It's always about the big, large infrastructure, because that's the popular imagination that we have of development. So I think we need to also reconsider these dynamics and say, what does development mean? And let's look at it as a bottom-up process. What does it mean for communities who are not able to access the city, who are not able, the city is not for everybody. So I think I will leave it at that and see from a planning perspective, how do we bring in some of these more fundamental questions into the planning parlance?
Thank you, Dr. Anjali. I continuously see a theme emerging of multifunctionality of these to serve as an answer to more than one problem, for it to be integrated, not just mitigation, but mitigation and resilience and livelihood generation, for nature to be part of urban development. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I would also like to pose the second question to Dr. Thruba here. When we speak about innovation and new technology, as mid-sized cities are increasingly attracting these investments for economic growth, infrastructure development, etc., how can we make sure that that is harmonized with the need to develop equitable nature-based cities?
Thanks. I know my response is to the second part of the question, but we have to all fundamentally accept that all human nature, if we are left untethered, we will not do the right things. So if you don't accept that, therefore the need to balance comes because we as collective humans in society need, is an anthropologist, you need a sociology over here and a political scientist over here for that regulation of human behavior to come in. So if we are not left to push waste and discard and separate waste at source, we do not separate waste at source. And therefore, the source waste get mixed up and that goes to the farms that leachate, and that incinerates, and that creates pollution, and the leachate then goes back as arsenic, comes back to your drinking water, and then we say groundwater is polluted. So you need regulation, you need standards. So the answer to that is, how can that be harmonized? Well, not by thinking, not by our goodness of heart of thinking about it, but by proper regulation, by standards and enforcement of that standards. The whole problem with our cities is our enforcement systems are weak of whatever we have. I am not saying we have 3 acts in place, and they are from the 80s, the Air Act, the Water Act, and the EPA. And it's time that 45 years later, we need to revise them. We need to revise them to bring in nature. We need to revise them to bring in climate. We need to revise them to bring in livability into what is now getting called as a livable planet. So therefore, those requirements have to get embedded in standards and regulation, leaving it to our, so the answer to the question is something like this, that how can we ensure that they are harmonized with what is needed for equitable nature-based cities? You need regulation, 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 and enforcement of that regulation. And in India, we need policing, and that regulation needs policing. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ruben. And I agree. I think a strong institutional regulatory framework as we grow economically to make sure that we are doing it the right way is very important. We are at the end of our time. Our questions are keep flowing in, so but we also want to be respectful of everyone's time and our panelists' time here. What we will do is we'll take these questions and continue the conversation on social media and on different ways of reaching out. But as we approach the end of our dialogue today, I'd sincerely like to thank our panelists and all the attendees for an engaging and insightful urbanization. Historically, urbanization has taken place at the expense of biodiversity and ecosystems, and India's mid-sized cities today have the opportunity to challenge that trajectory. So with the insights from today, from our panelists today, and on how to navigate rapid urban expansion, climate change, and the needs of communities, this conversation is not over, clearly, based on how many questions we have left unanswered. So let's continue that engagement as we expand and find out better solutions. But once again, thank you so much, Dr. Tribha, Dr. Anjali, Dr. Vikram, and everyone who attended, who's here.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. I would just add one word to what was spoken about regulation and enforcement is also awareness. We need
Okay,
awareness
yeah.
and communication
Okay,
because
sure.
the two cannot be
Okay,
separated,
yeah,
and we really need
accepted.
that.
I was
Thank you.
taking that for granted that it is there. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yes.
That's the
Thank
beauty
you.
of
Thank you.
different perspectives on the topic. To really round up the discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Right.